Sometimes the strongest bond isn't forged through force, but through trust in something everyone else has given up on. In a dusty Montana town, one weathered horse trainer chose compassion over common sense. Elias, Whisper Vance, spent his very last dollar on Midnight, a powerful black stallion that had thrown every rider and was hours from being shot. The town called him a fool. They said he'd bought 4 legs of pure rage. But Whisper didn't believe in breaking spirits. He believed in earning trust. What happened next defied everything those townspeople knew about horses, men, and the secrets buried beyond Razorback Ridge. What could a wild stallion possibly show a man patient enough to listen? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1878 came to Montana Territory like a curse. By late July, the grasslands around Copper Springs had turned from gold to ash gray, and the creek that gave the town its name had slowed to a trickle that barely filled a man's canteen. Dust devils danced through the main street at noon, and the cattle that hadn't already been sold off stood hollow-eyed in whatever shade they could find. Elias Vance, though most folks called him Whisper, stood at the fence line of his small ranch, watching the sun bleed red across the western sky. He was 52 years old, with hands that bore the texture of old leather and eyes the color of weathered oak. His hair had gone mostly gray, though streaks of the brown it used to be still showed through when the light hit it right. He wasn't a tall man, but there was something solid about him, something that spoke of a life spent outdoors, and a body that had learned to move with purpose rather than haste. The ranch itself wasn't much to look at. 20 acres of stubborn Montana earth, a barn that leaned slightly to the north, a house with a porch that needed new boards, and a corral that had seen better days. But it was his, or at least it had been his father's before him, and that meant something. His father, Samuel Vance, had been a cavalry scout before settling here, a man who understood horses the way some men understood scripture. Whisper reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a silver pocket watch, its case worn smooth by decades of handling. He didn't need to open it to know what he'd see. The inscription inside read, "To Samuel, who taught me horses, have souls, Captain J. Morrison, 1856. His father had carried this watch through the Indian Wars, through blizzards and ambushes, and had passed it to Elias on his deathbed with simple words, "A man who can't listen to a horse ain't worth the dust on his boots." That philosophy had guided Whisper's entire life. While other trainers in the territory believed in breaking a horse's will, ropes and whips and fear, Whisper had built his reputation on patience. He'd spend weeks with an animal, sometimes months, learning its nature before ever attempting to ride it. The approach had earned him respect from some and mockery from others. Horses that other men gave up on were gentle under his hands, not because he dominated them, but because he earned their trust. The problem was, trust didn't pay the mortgage. He looked down at the envelope in his other hand, the one that had arrived 3 days ago from the territorial bank, past due. Final notice, 60 days to settle accounts, or the property would be seized and auctioned. The number at the bottom of the page might as well have been written in blood, $217. In better times, that wouldn't have been insurmountable, but the drought had driven away clients. Ranchers couldn't afford to pay for training when they were selling off stock just to survive. His last job had been 6 weeks ago, a mare for the Johnson's daughter, and that had paid him $12. He had $47.30 to his name, not nearly enough. The sound of hooves on the dirt road pulled him from his thoughts. A rider approached Sheriff Tom Bodie on his roan gelding. Tom was a few years younger than Whisper, with a thick mustache that had gone completely white, and a badge that sat heavy on his chest. They'd known each other since Tom had arrived in Copper Springs 15 years back, and the friendship between them was the kind that didn't require many words. "Evening, Whisper," Tom said, reining in his horse. "Tom," Whisper nodded. "Bit late for a social call." "Not social." Tom dismounted and walked over to the fence, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. "Wanted to give you a heads up. Marcus Bray's been asking around town about your place." Marcus Bray. The name alone made Whisper's jaw tighten. Bray was a land speculator who'd arrived in Copper Springs 2 years back with money from back east and a talent for smelling weakness. He'd already bought up 3 failing ranches during the drought, paying pennies on the dollar and then leasing the land back to desperate men at rates that kept them permanently in debt. "Let him ask," Whisper said quietly. "He knows about the bank notice, Elias. Whole town knows by now." Tom's expression was sympathetic, but realistic. "He's waiting for the foreclosure. He'll bid on it at auction and pick it up for nothing. I've got 60 days. To come up with $200? Doing what? There's no work, Whisper. The drought's killed everything." Whisper didn't answer. He knew Tom was right. He knew the situation was desperate, but he also knew that a man couldn't give up just because the odds looked bad. His father had taught him that too. "There's an auction tomorrow," Tom said after a moment. "Down at the stockyards. Might be some horses there you could buy cheap and turn around quick. I know it's not your usual approach, but I don't train horses to flip them for profit. I know. But maybe just this once you could make an exception. For practical reasons." The 2 men stood in silence for a moment, watching the last of the daylight fade. Finally, Tom cleared his throat. "Just think about it, friend. Pride's worth something, but so's keeping a roof over your head." He mounted his horse and tipped his hat. "I'll see you around." Whisper watched him ride off toward town, then turned back to look at his ranch. The barn door hung open, and inside he could see the stalls all empty now except for his own mare, a 15-year-old bay named Sage. He'd sold off his other 2 horses last month just to buy feed and pay what he could toward the debt. He walked to the barn, his boots echoing on the worn planks. Sage nickered softly as he approached, and he stroked her neck, feeling the warmth of her coat beneath his palm. A worn leather bridle hung on the wall beside her stall, the one he'd made himself 20 years ago when he'd first started training on his own. The leather was cracked now, darkened by sweat and weather, but it had served him well. It represented everything he believed in: gentle hands, patient hearts, and respect for the animal. "What do you think, girl?" he murmured to the mare. "Do I compromise everything I believe in just to keep this place?" Sage nudged his shoulder, and he smiled faintly. Horses didn't judge. They didn't offer advice. They just were. That was part of what he loved about them. The sound of a wagon approaching made him turn. Through the barn door, he could see a small buggy pulling up to the house. The driver was Sadie Crane, the widow who ran the saloon in town. She was in her late 40s, with auburn hair streaked with grey and eyes that had seen enough of life to be kind without being naive. Her husband had died in a mine collapse 5 years back, and she'd turned the saloon into one of the few profitable businesses in Copper Springs by running it honest and treating her customers with dignity. "Evening, Elias," she called as she climbed down from the buggy, carrying a covered basket. "Sadie." He walked out to meet her. "What brings you out here?" "Heard you might not be eating regular." She handed him the basket. "Roast chicken, potatoes, and some bread. Don't argue with me about it." He accepted the basket, knowing better than to refuse. Sadie wasn't the type to take no for an answer when she'd made up her mind to help someone. "Thank you," he said simply. She studied him for a moment, her expression serious. "Tom told me about the bank notice. Seems everyone knows. It's a small town, Elias. People talk." She paused. "If you need help, I don't take charity." "I wasn't offering charity. I was offering friendship." Her voice was gentle but firm. "You helped me when Robert died, sat with me when I didn't want to be alone, fixed my wagon wheel when I couldn't afford to pay the smithy. That's what people do for each other." Whisper looked down at the basket in his hands. Pride was a strange thing. It could keep a man standing when everything told him to fall, but it could also keep him from accepting the hand that might pull him back from the edge. "I appreciate it, Sadie. Truly." She smiled then, just a small curve of her lips. "There's an auction tomorrow. Horses. Might be worth looking at. Tom mentioned it. You should go. Even if you don't buy anything, it wouldn't hurt to see what's available." She climbed back into her buggy. "And Elias? Don't let pride make decisions that common sense should be making." He watched her drive away, then carried the basket inside. The house was quiet, too quiet, really. It had been that way since his wife, Mary, had died 7 years ago from pneumonia, and before that, since their son had died at age 4 from scarlet fever. The silence had become normal, but that didn't mean he liked it. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with the basket's contents spread before him and the bank notice beside his plate. He ate slowly, tasting every bite the way a man does when he doesn't know where his next meal might come from. The chicken was good. Sadie was a fine cook, but his mind wasn't on the food. $217, 60 days, an auction tomorrow. He thought about his father, about the cavalry scout who'd understood horses better than most men understood their own wives. Samuel Vance had never owned much, but he'd owned himself, his dignity, his principles, his way of doing things. Was there honor in losing everything because you refused to compromise? Or was there wisdom in bending just enough to survive? Sleep didn't come easy that night. He lay in bed, listening to the wind move through the eaves and the distant sound of a coyote calling somewhere out in the darkness. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of horses, wild ones, running free across grasslands that hadn't yet learned what drought meant. He woke before dawn, as was his habit. After tending to Sage and doing his morning chores, he stood in front of the small mirror by the wash basin and studied his reflection. The face looking back at him was weathered and tired, but it was honest. Whatever decision he made today, he'd have to live with it for the rest of his life. He put on his cleanest shirt, a faded blue cotton that Mary had made for him years ago, and his least worn vest. He retrieved his father's pocket watch from the bedside table and slipped it into the vest pocket, where it settled with a comfortable weight against his ribs. Then he saddled Sage and rode toward town. Copper Springs was already stirring when he arrived. The main street ran straight through the center of town, lined with wooden buildings that had weathered to gray. The saloon, the general store, the bank, the sheriff's office, the livery stable, all the pieces that made up a frontier settlement. Wagons and horses crowded the stockyard at the south end of town, where the auction would be held. He could see townspeople gathering, ranchers in worn hats, speculators in cleaner clothes, and curious onlookers who'd come for the entertainment. Among them, he spotted Marcus Bray, standing near the auctioneer's platform. Bray was a tall man, with slicked-back hair and a suit that looked out of place in a town like this. He was talking to another man, gesturing with his hands, and when he caught sight of Whisper, he smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. Whisper dismounted and tied Sage to the hitching rail, then made his way through the crowd. The air smelled of dust and livestock and sweat. Men called greetings to him, some genuine, others edged with pity. Everyone knew about the foreclosure notice by now. In a town this small, private troubles became public knowledge faster than wildfire. "Elias Vance," a young voice called. He turned to see Danny Reeves, a 17-year-old who worked odd jobs around town and spent his spare time at Whisper's ranch, learning whatever he could about horses. The boy had sandy hair and eager eyes and a way of showing up exactly when he wasn't expected. "You here to buy?" "Just looking," Whisper said. "They say there's a wild one today. Real mean, nobody can ride him." Danny's excitement was palpable. "They're gonna shoot him if nobody takes him." Whisper felt something stir in his chest, not quite hope, not quite dread, just a sense that something significant was about to happen. He'd learned to trust that feeling over the years. It had kept him alive more than once. The auctioneer climbed onto the platform and raised his hands for attention. The crowd quieted, and the auction began. Horses were brought out one by one, mares, geldings, a few colts. Bidding was sluggish, money was tight, and most folks were holding on to what they had. And then they brought out midnight. The stallion came into the yard in chains, 4 men struggling to control him. He was massive, 17 hands at least, with a coat so black it seemed to swallow light. His eyes rolled white with fear and rage, and his hooves struck the ground with enough force to raise clouds of dust. Scars marked his shoulders and flanks, evidence of hard use and harder treatment. The crowd fell silent. Even the auctioneer hesitated before speaking. "Here's Midnight," he called out. 5 years old, strong as they come. Fair warning, though, this horse has thrown every rider who's tried him. Injured 3 men, killed 1. Owner's giving you all a chance to take him, but if nobody bids, he gets put down tonight." Whisper stared at the stallion. Beneath the rage, beneath the fear, he saw something else. He saw a creature that had been brutalized, that had learned violence as the only language humans spoke. He saw intelligence in those rolling eyes, saw the way the horse calculated its movements, saw the power that could be redirected towards something other than destruction. He saw himself, in a way, something that wouldn't break, no matter how hard the world pushed. The auctioneer started the bidding at $50. Silence. He dropped it to 30. Still silence. 20. $5 then. Anyone? $5 for this animal or he's done. Whisper's hand went to his vest pocket, feeling the weight of his father's watch. A man who can't listen to a horse ain't worth the dust on his boots. He raised his hand. $47, he called out, his voice steady. The crowd erupted in murmurs. He could hear the word fool more than once. The auctioneer looked surprised, but nodded. $47 to Mr. Vance. Anyone bid 50? Silence. Marcus Bray laughed, an ugly sound that carried across the yard. Going once, going twice, sold to Elias Vance for $47. As the auctioneer's gavel fell, Whisper heard Tom's voice from somewhere in the crowd. "God help you." Whisper. Danny appeared at his side, eyes wide. "That's every cent you have." "I know. What are you going to do?" Whisper watched as the men struggled to bring Midnight toward him. The stallion fought every step, his muscles bunching and releasing beneath that midnight coat. "I'm going to listen," Whisper said quietly, "and hope he's got something to say." The men brought Midnight forward with the kind of caution usually reserved for handling dynamite. Heavy chains wrapped around his neck and legs, and each of the 4 handlers kept maximum distance, their ropes pulled taut. The stallion's breathing came hard and fast, steam rising from his nostrils in the morning air despite the summer heat. His coat was slick with sweat, and foam flecked his mouth where the bit had cut into his gums. Whisper walked forward slowly, and the crowd quieted. Even those who'd been laughing moments before seemed to understand they were witnessing something, though whether it would be a miracle or a tragedy remained to be seen. "Hold him steady," the auctioneer said to the handlers, his voice tight with worry. "Mr. Vance, you sure about this? Last chance to back out. I can refund your money right now." "I'm sure," Whisper said. He stopped about 10 feet from the stallion, close enough to see clearly but far enough not to crowd him. He wanted to observe, to understand what he was dealing with before making any moves. Midnight's head swung toward him, ears pinned flat against his skull. The horse's eyes were wide, showing the whites all around, and his nostrils flared as he took in Whisper's scent. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to strike. This wasn't just a wild horse. This was a creature that had learned to survive by fighting, by refusing to submit, by meeting violence with greater violence. The head handler, a burly man named Pete Garson, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "You want us to load him in your trailer, Vance? Though I gotta tell you, last time we tried to move him, he kicked through 2 inches of oak planking." "How'd you get him here?" Whisper asked, still watching the horse. "Walked him from the Brennan place. Took 6 hours for 3 miles. Garson shook his head. "Horse fought us every step. Near broke Charlie's arm when he spooked at a snake. Tell me about his history." "Not much to tell. Jacob Brennan bought him at a wild horse auction 2 years back, thinking he'd break him for stud. Big, strong, good lines, but this one's got the devil in him. First rider lasted about 5 seconds, broke his collarbone when he hit the ground. Second rider got thrown into a fence post concussion. Third rider managed to stay on for maybe 10 seconds, and the horse threw him so hard he shattered his leg in 4 places. And the man who died? Garson's expression darkened. That was Jacob's nephew. Tom, different Tom than the sheriff. Young fellow, full of vinegar, thought he could show everyone how it's done. Horse threw him backward, and he landed wrong, broke his neck. He paused. After that, Jacob gave up, said the horse was cursed. Had him chained up in a pen for the last 6 months. Been trying to sell him or give him away ever since. Whisper absorbed this information silently. 6 months in chains. Before that, 2 years of violent confrontations. And before that, what? Where had this horse come from? What had shaped him before Jacob Brennan bought him? He noticed something then. Hanging in the stallion's mane, tangled in the thick black hair, was a scrap of fabric. It was small, maybe 3 inches across, and stained dark with age and dirt. But there was a pattern, visible stripes, faded but distinct. "Can I get closer?" Whisper asked. "Your funeral," Garson muttered. But he signaled to the other handlers, and they adjusted their positions, ready to pull the horse back if he lunged. Whisper moved forward 1 slow step at a time. He kept his hands visible, down at his sides, and he breathed deeply, letting his own calm radiate outward. It was something his father had taught him. Horses could sense fear, but they could also sense peace. A man who came at them with quiet confidence could sometimes slip beneath their defenses where aggression never would. Midnight's ears flickered forward for just a second before pinning back again. The horse snorted and stamped, but he didn't charge. Whisper took another step. The stallion's head came up, neck arching, body tensing. But still, he didn't strike. "Easy now," Whisper said, his voice barely above a whisper, the tone that had earned him his nickname. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Not anymore." Another step. He was close enough now to see the scars more clearly. Some were old, faded marks that spoke of breaking attempts gone wrong. Others were fresher, the kind that came from chains and confinement. On the horse's left flank there was a brand, partially obscured by the scarring, a circle with a star inside. It wasn't a ranch brand that Whisper recognized. He reached out slowly, his hand open, palm up. The gesture was an offering, not a demand. Midnight's nostrils flared again, and for a moment Whisper thought the horse might bite. But instead, the stallion just stood there, trembling, every instinct telling him to fight, but something else, exhaustion maybe, or curiosity holding him still. Whisper didn't touch him, not yet. He just let his hand stay there, an invitation, and he spoke softly. "I see you," he said. "I see what they did to you. I see how you fought back, and I don't blame you for a second of it." Behind him, someone in the crowd laughed. Marcus Bray's voice carried clear across the stockyard. "Talking to a horse like it's your sweetheart, that $47 is already wasted, Vance." Others joined in the laughter. Whisper ignored them. His entire focus was on the animal in front of him, on the rapid beating of that massive heart, on the intelligence behind those fear-bright eyes. "I'm not going to break you," he continued, still in that same quiet tone. "I'm not going to hurt you, but I am going to ask you to trust me. Just a little bit, just enough to give us both a chance." The stallion's breathing began to slow, just fractionally. The tension in his muscles didn't disappear, but it eased from explosive to merely vigilant. Whisper lowered his hand and took a step back, giving the horse space. "I'll take him now," he said to Garson. "How?" Garson looked genuinely confused. "You gonna walk him 3 miles to your place on those chains?" "Take the chains off." The crowd went dead silent. Even the auctioneer looked shocked. "Mr. Vance," Garson said carefully, "if we take these chains off, there's a good chance he'll kill somebody. Maybe you, maybe one of us, maybe some innocent bystander. I can't allow that." "Then I'll do it myself," Whisper said. He walked to where Garson stood and held out his hand. "Give me the keys." "This is insane." "The keys, Pete," Sheriff Tom Bodie pushed through the crowd. "Whisper, think about what you're doing. This animal is dangerous." "He's dangerous because he's terrified," Whisper replied. He looked at Tom steadily. "Are you going to arrest me for freeing my own horse?" Tom's jaw worked. Finally he shook his head. "No, but I'm going to clear these people back in case this goes wrong." While Tom ushered the crowd to a safer distance, Pete Garson reluctantly handed over the keys. Whisper could feel every eye on him as he approached midnight again. The horse watched him come, and there was something different in his gaze now, not trust, exactly, but perhaps a glimmer of confusion. This human was acting differently than the others. Whisper started with the leg chains. He moved slowly, telegraphing every motion, and he kept talking in that low, steady voice. "Just going to take these off. They're too tight. They're hurting you. I can see the raw spots where they've been rubbing." The first lock clicked open. Midnight flinched but didn't kick. The second lock, the third. When the leg chains fell away, the stallion stamped and shifted, testing his new freedom. But he didn't bolt. The neck chain was harder. Whisper had to get close, had to reach up near the horse's head, the most dangerous position possible. One bite, one strike with those powerful teeth, and he'd lose an arm, or worse. But he moved with the same deliberate calm, his hands steady, despite the fear coiling in his own belly. "Almost done," he murmured. "Almost free." The lock opened. The chain slithered to the ground with a heavy metallic sound. Midnight stood there, unchained for the first time in half a year, with nothing but empty space between him and freedom. The horse looked at Whisper. Whisper looked back. And then, slowly, Midnight lowered his head, just an inch, just enough to be noticeable. It wasn't submission, it wasn't surrender, it was acknowledgement. This human had done something no other had. He'd freed instead of confined. "Come on," Whisper said softly. He turned his back on the stallion, a move that made the crowd gasp, and began walking toward where Sage was tied. He didn't look back, he didn't hurry. He just walked with the same steady confidence he'd shown throughout. Behind him, he heard the crunch of hooves on dirt. Heavy breathing, the sound of a massive animal moving, but the footsteps didn't accelerate into a charge. They stayed measured, following at a distance. When Whisper reached Sage, he untied her and climbed into the saddle. Only then did he turn to look at Midnight. The stallion stood about 20 feet away, still wary, still ready to bolt. But he was following, choosing to follow. "Let's go home," Whisper said. He nudged Sage into a walk, heading north out of town toward his ranch. Behind him, after a pause that felt like an eternity, came the sound of Midnight's hooves. The crowd erupted into chatter. Some called him crazy, others called him lucky. Marcus Bray called him a dead man walking. Sheriff Tom just shook his head, somewhere between admiration and concern. But Danny Reeves, standing at the edge of the stockyard, watched the man and the two horses disappear down the road and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he'd just witnessed the beginning of something remarkable, or possibly the beginning of something tragic. Time, he supposed, would tell the difference. The 3-mile walk from town to the ranch took just under an hour. Midnight kept his distance the entire way, never closing within 15 feet, but never dropping back farther than 30. Whisper didn't try to force proximity. He just rode Sage at an easy pace, occasionally speaking in low tones, but mostly letting the silence do its work. When they reached the ranch, Whisper dismounted and opened the gate to the largest corral, the one with good, strong fencing and no sharp corners where an animal could trap itself. He unsaddled Sage and turned her loose in the adjacent paddock, then stood at the corral gate, leaving it open. Midnight stopped at the property line, as if an invisible barrier stood between him and this new place. His nostrils worked, testing the air. His ears swiveled, catching every sound. Whisper could see the horse weighing his options: run back into the wild lands beyond town, or step into this uncertain territory with the human who'd freed him. "Your choice," Whisper said aloud. "But there's water in that trough, and I'll bring hay out in a bit. Storm's coming in tonight. You can see the clouds building west. Corral's got a shelter if you want it." He walked away then, leaving the gate open, and went into his house. Through the window, he watched as Midnight stood there for another 10 minutes before finally, cautiously, stepping through the gate. The horse moved like he was walking on broken glass, every step deliberate and wary. When he reached the water trough, he sniffed it thoroughly before drinking. Then he moved to the farthest corner of the corral, put his back to the fence, and watched the house. That first night, Whisper slept poorly. He woke every hour to check on the stallion, making sure he hadn't jumped the fence or injured himself trying. Each time, Midnight was in that same corner, standing guard against whatever threats he imagined in the darkness. The horse didn't lie down, didn't rest, just stood there, vigilant. By morning, Whisper knew he was dealing with an animal who hadn't felt safe enough to sleep in a very long time. The first week became a study in patience. Whisper established a routine, something he knew horses craved, even when they fought against everything else. Every morning at dawn, he'd come out to the corral with hay and fresh water. He'd speak to Midnight in that quiet voice, never demanding, never aggressive. Then he'd go about his other chores, always visible, but never crowding. Danny showed up on the second day, riding his father's mule. The boy had a hunger to learn that reminded Whisper of himself at that age. "Figured you could use help," Danny said, tying the mule to the porch rail. "Figured right," Whisper replied, "but we do this my way. No sudden moves, no loud noises, and if I tell you to back off, you back off immediately." "Yes, sir." They worked together that morning, mending fence and mucking out Sage's stall. All the while, Midnight watched from his corner. He didn't approach, but Whisper noticed his ears weren't pinned back anymore. Small progress. On the third day, Whisper found a child's toy while cleaning out the barn's storage loft, a carved wooden horse no bigger than his palm, with delicate legs and a flowing mane. His hands trembled slightly as he held it. His son, James, had played with this, had carried it everywhere when he was 3 and 4 years old, had clenched it in his small fist the night the fever took him, 14 years ago now. Mary had carved it herself, working by lamplight to surprise the boy for his birthday. After James died, Whisper had put the toy away, unable to look at it. Finding it now felt like a message, though he wasn't sure from whom or what it meant. He sat on an overturned bucket, turning the wooden horse over in his hands. James would have been 18 now, a young man, maybe working the ranch alongside his father, maybe gone off to make his own way in the world. Mary would have loved to see him grown, but Fever didn't care about what might have been. "You all right, Mr. Vance?" Whisper looked up to find Danny standing in the barn doorway, concern on his young face. He realized his eyes had gotten wet. "Just remembering," Whisper said. He stood and tucked the wooden horse into his pocket. "Come on, let's see if our friend out there is ready for another step." The step was simply sitting near the corral fence. Not approaching Midnight, not trying to interact, just being present. Whisper sat on a stump about 10 feet from the fence, and Danny sat beside him. They talked about horses, about training methods, about what Danny hoped to do with his life. The boy wanted to work with animals, wanted to learn what Whisper knew. "My pa thinks it's foolish," Danny admitted. "Says there's no money in being gentle with livestock." "Your pa might be right about the money," Whisper said, "but he's wrong about it being foolish. There's different kinds of wealth in this world." As they talked, Midnight edged closer. Just a few feet at first, then a few more. By the time the sun reached its peak, the horse was standing at the fence line, close enough that Whisper could have reached through and touched him if he'd been foolish enough to try. But he didn't try. He just kept talking with Danny, kept his posture relaxed, kept sending the message that he wasn't a threat. On the 4th day, Sheriff Tom rode out to check on things. "Town's got a betting pool going," he said, dismounting. "Most folks have you lasting less than 2 weeks before either the horse kills you or you give up and sell him." "That's so. Marcus Bray's betting you'll be dead within the month. Put up $20 on it." Tom leaned against the corral fence, studying Midnight. Horse does look slightly less homicidal than he did at the auction. He's learning we're not all the same. And you? You learning anything about him? Whisper considered the question. I'm learning he's smarter than most men I've met, and I'm learning there's a reason he fought so hard. Something in his past. Something that taught him humans weren't to be trusted. Tom pulled an envelope from his pocket. Speaking of things in the past, this came for you from the bank. Thought I'd bring it out personal rather than have it sit at the post office. Whisper took the envelope. Already knowing what it would say, he opened it and scanned the contents. 43 days remaining. Payment in full required. No extensions available. I'm sorry, Elias, Tom said quietly. Nothing to be sorry for. It's just the way of things. Whisper folded the notice and put it in his pocket alongside the wooden horse. 2 reminders of what he had to lose. By the end of the first week, midnight would approach the fence when Whisper brought food. He wouldn't take anything from Whisper's hand yet, but he'd wait until the man had moved away only 5 or 6 feet before eating. Progress measured in inches and minutes. On the 7th night, Whisper sat on his porch as the sun went down, watching the corral. Midnight had finally laid down to sleep the first time since arriving. The horse's head was up, still alert, but his legs were folded beneath him and his eyes were half closed. It was trust, Whisper knew. Small and tentative, but real. The question was whether they had enough time to build on it. 43 days to come up with money he didn't have. 43 days to turn this damaged creature into something the world would recognize as valuable. 43 days to justify the faith he'd placed in following his principles instead of his pocketbook. Danny had stayed for supper, simple beans and cornbread, and now the boy was getting ready to ride home. "Mr. Vance," he said, pausing by his mule, "what you're doing with that horse, it matters, even if nobody else sees it." Whisper smiled slightly. "You see it. That's something." After Danny left, Whisper went to the barn and retrieved that worn leather bridle from the wall. He held it in the lamplight, examining every stitch, every crack in the leather. This bridle had never been used to hurt. Every horse that had worn it had learned to accept it as communication, not domination. If he could get Midnight to accept this bridle, it would mean something. It would mean they'd moved from survival to partnership. He hung it back on the wall and turned to find Midnight standing at the corral fence, silhouetted against the darkening sky. The horse was watching the barn, watching him. Their eyes met across the distance, and Whisper felt it again, that sense that something significant was unfolding, something beyond his understanding. "We'll figure this out," he said to the horse, though he wasn't sure if he meant training or trust, or the looming foreclosure, or all of it together. Somehow, "we'll figure it out." Midnight snorted and turned away, moving back to his corner, but this time he lay down again almost immediately, and this time his head dropped all the way to the ground. He was sleeping, really sleeping, trusting that nothing would attack him in the night. It was, Whisper thought, the first honest gift the horse had given him. By the 3rd week, the transformation was undeniable. Midnight would approach the fence when Whisper called, would take hay directly from his hand, and had even allowed briefly a touch on his shoulder. The scars were still there, physical and mental, but beneath them something else was emerging. The horse's true nature, perhaps. Whatever he'd been before, the chains and the beatings and the fear. Whisper had made a rope halter himself, sitting on his porch in the evenings and braiding the cord with the same patient precision he brought to everything. It was soft rope, nothing that would cut or chafe, and he'd sized it carefully to Midnight's massive head. The halter represented the next step, a physical connection, a way to communicate direction without force. On a Tuesday morning, with Danny watching from outside the corral, Whisper carried the halter in plain sight as he approached Midnight. The horse's eyes tracked the object, and tension rippled through his body. He backed up several steps. "Easy," Whisper said. "Just rope. Nothing to hurt you, see?" He held the halter up, let Midnight see it from all angles, then set it on the ground between them. "I'm going to leave it right here. You can look at it all you want." He backed away. For an hour, Midnight circled that halter like it was a coiled snake. He'd approach, stretch his neck out to sniff it, then retreat. Whisper sat on his stump and waited. Danny sat beside him, barely breathing. Finally, Midnight walked up to the halter and nudged it with his nose. When it didn't attack him, he nudged it again. Then he looked at Whisper, and there was something almost like a question in his eyes. "Yeah," Whisper said softly, "that's for you, but only if you want it." He stood and approached slowly, picking up the halter. Midnight tensed, but didn't bolt. Whisper raised the halter, moving with exaggerated slowness, and brought it toward the horse's head. Midnight threw his head up, dancing backward. "All right," Whisper said. "Not today. That's fine." It took 3 more days. 3 days of approaching, retreating, letting the horse set the pace. But on Friday, Midnight stood still, as Whisper slipped the halter over his ears and settled it on his face. The horse's breathing came fast and shallow, every muscle coiled, but he didn't fight. And when Whisper stepped back, giving him space, Midnight shook his head once, testing the feel of it, then seemed to accept it. "Good boy," Whisper murmured. "Good, brave boy." Danny let out a whoop from outside the fence, and Midnight startled slightly but didn't panic. Progress. Real, measurable progress. That same afternoon, a fancy buggy rolled up the road to the ranch. Marcus Bray climbed down, dressed in a fine suit that probably cost more than Whisper made in a year. He walked to the corral fence, looked at Midnight, and smiled. "Heard you got a halter on him," Bray said. "Impressive. Maybe you're not as foolish as everyone thinks. What do you want, Marcus?" "To make you an offer." Bray pulled a leather wallet from his jacket. $200 for the horse. Right here, right now. That's more than 4 times what you paid. Whisper felt his heart skip. $200. Almost enough to save the ranch. Add in the $40-some in credit he might scrape together, and he'd be solvent. Safe. Secure. $300, Bray said, reading Whisper's hesitation. "Final offer. That's enough to pay your debt and have money left over. You could keep this place, Vance. All you have to do is sell me a horse you've had for 3 weeks. Whisper looked at Midnight. The stallion was watching him, the halter still on his head, trust and wariness mixed in equal measure in those dark eyes. This horse had been sold before, passed from hand to hand like property. Each time, he'd been hurt. Each time, he'd learned that trust was a mistake. "No," Whisper said quietly. "No?" Bray's smile faded. "Are you insane? You're about to lose everything." "Maybe, but I gave this horse my word I wouldn't hurt him. Selling him to you, that would hurt him." Bray's expression hardened. "You don't even know what I'd do with him. I know you don't care about horses. You care about money. You'd either try to break him rough to prove you could, or you'd sell him to someone who would. Either way, I'd be breaking my promise." Whisper met Bray's eyes steadily. "So no. You're a fool, Vance. A sentimental fool who's about to be homeless." Bray climbed back into his buggy. "When the bank takes this place, I'll be at that auction, and I'll get this land for pennies. Remember that you could have prevented it." He drove away, leaving a trail of dust hanging in the air. Whisper stood at the fence, his hands gripping the rough wood, and fought down the surge of doubt and fear. Had he just made the biggest mistake of his life? Danny's voice came from behind him. "That was the right choice." "Was it? Because from where I'm standing, the right choice looks a lot like losing everything." "Not everything," Danny said. "You still got your word, you still got your principles, and you still got that horse." Whisper turned to look at the boy. "Sometimes I forget how young you are, Danny. Then you say something like that, and I remember wisdom doesn't have an age requirement." That evening, Sadie arrived with another basket of food. She also brought news. "Someone paid a month of your mortgage," she said, setting the basket on the porch. "The bank called it an anonymous donation." Whisper studied her face. "Sadie, I don't know who it was," she said, but her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. "Could have been anyone in town who wanted to help." "Could have been," he agreed, though they both knew the truth. "If I ever find out who, I'll pay them back, with interest. Ruma, I'm sure whoever it was doesn't expect that. She paused, then stepped closer. Elias, what you're doing with that horse, it matters. Not just because you're saving an animal, but because you're showing everyone that there's still room for compassion in this hard world. That means something. He reached out and took her hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. Her skin was warm, her fingers rough from work but gentle in his grip. Thank you, he said, for the food. She smiled, and color touched her cheeks. You're welcome, for everything. After she left, Whisper stood on his porch and calculated numbers in his head. 1 month's payment bought him time, but he still owed $150 with barely a month left to find it. The situation was still desperate, but somehow, with Sadie's support and Danny's faith and Midnight's tentative trust, it felt less hopeless than it had before. In the corral, Midnight stood with his head over the fence, looking toward the ridge in the distance. It was a pose Whisper had noticed before the horse would stare at Razorback Ridge like he was searching for something, or remembering something, or waiting for something. "What's out there?" Whisper asked aloud. "What are you looking for?" The horse's ears swiveled toward his voice, but his gaze stayed fixed on the ridge. In the fading light, with the halter on his head and that strange intensity in his posture, Midnight looked less like a broken animal and more like a creature with a purpose, something unfinished, something calling him. Whisper felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm evening. He'd spent 3 weeks earning this horse's trust, but he was starting to suspect that Midnight had been waiting for something all along, not waiting to be rescued. Exactly. Waiting for the right person to rescue him. Someone patient enough, gentle enough, trustworthy enough to follow where he needed to go. "Where are you trying to take me?" Whisper whispered. Midnight pawed the ground 3 times, then turned and walked to the far corner of the corral, but his head swung back once, just for a moment, and Whisper could have sworn the horse was checking to see if he was paying attention. He was paying attention. The question was whether he'd have the courage to follow when the time came. The discovery came on a Thursday morning while Whisper was grooming Midnight. The horse had been allowing more and more contact each day, and now stood patiently while Whisper worked a brush through his coat. The physical closeness had revealed details that distance had hidden: the pattern of scars, the peculiar shape of the brand on his flank, and something Whisper hadn't noticed before. Tangled deep in the horse's thick mane was a piece of fabric. He'd seen it at the auction but hadn't been able to examine it closely. Now, with careful fingers, he worked it free. Midnight tensed, but allowed it. The fabric was about 4 inches across, weathered and stained, but clearly once part of something larger. Stripes ran across it, red and white, faded but unmistakable. An American flag, or rather, a fragment of one. Whisper turned it over in his hands, his mind working. A flag tangled in a horse's mane, a horse with scars and a military-style brand. A horse that stared at Razorback Ridge like it held the answer to some unspoken question. The pieces didn't quite fit together yet, but they were starting to form a picture. "Danny," he called. The boy was mucking out the barn. "Come here a minute." Danny jogged over, wiping his hands on his pants. "Yes, sir? You're good with town history. You remember anything about military activity around here? Maybe 5, 6 years back?" Danny squinted, thinking, "Well, there was that payroll wagon that went missing, but that was, 5 years ago this spring." "Why? Tell me about it." "Not much to tell, really. Union Army wagon carrying soldier pay from Fort Benton down to the garrison at Copper Springs. 6 soldiers escorting it. They left Fort Benton on schedule but never arrived. Search parties went out, but they never found the wagon or the men or the money. Just vanished." Whisper held up the fabric. "This was in Midnight's mane." Danny's eyes widened. "You think he was with that wagon?" "I think it's possible." Whisper looked at the horse, at the brand on his flank. "That brand, it's military, not any ranch mark I've seen. And he keeps looking at the ridge. What if he's not just looking? What if he's remembering?" "The search parties checked the ridge," Danny said. Didn't find anything. Did they check everywhere? Ridge is 30 miles long, full of canyons and ravines. Easy to miss something if you don't know exactly where to look. Whisper tucked the fabric into his pocket. I need to do some research. You mind watching midnight for a few hours? Course not. You going to town? Library. Old newspapers. I want to know everything about that wagon. An hour later, Whisper sat at a table in the Copper Springs Library, a one-room building that served as both library and schoolhouse. Mrs. Henderson, the librarian and schoolteacher, had helped him find the newspaper archives from 5 years ago. The relevant editions were spread before him. The story had been front-page news in April of 1873. Army payroll vanishes, read the headline. The article detailed what Danny had told him. 6 soldiers, 1 wagon, $50,000 in gold bullion meant for troop payment, departed Fort Benton on April 12th. Expected in Copper Springs on April 15th, never arrived. A follow-up article 2 weeks later, search for missing payroll continues. Parties had scoured the route between the forts. They'd found nothing, no wagon, no bodies, no sign of ambush or attack. Some speculated desertion, that the soldiers had stolen the gold and fled. Others thought Indian attack, though no tribes claimed responsibility. Still others believed a natural disaster, a flash flood, a landslide, had buried everything so completely that searchers missed it. The search was called off after a month. The soldiers were declared dead, their families received pensions, the gold was written off as lost, life moved on. But horses lived longer than newspaper stories, and midnight had scars that told a tale the papers couldn't. Whisper copied down names, the soldiers, the commanding officer who'd organized the search, the last person to see the wagon leave Fort Benton. Then he rolled up the newspapers and returned them to Mrs. Henderson. Find what you needed? She asked. Maybe. You remember that payroll wagon? Of course. Terrible tragedy. 6 young men just gone. Their poor families. She paused. Why do you ask? Just curious about local history. He didn't mention midnight. Not yet. Not until he understood more. On his way out of town, he stopped at the sheriff's office. Tom was at his desk, working through paperwork. He looked up when Whisper entered. Twice in 1 month. Should I be worried? Need to ask you about something. Whisper pulled out the flag fragment. You remember the lost payroll wagon? Tom's expression shifted, became more serious. 5 years ago. What about it? What if it's not lost? What if someone knows where it is? Someone like who? Like a horse that was there when it disappeared. Tom leaned back in his chair, studying Whisper's face. You think Midnight was part of that wagon team? Look at this. Whisper showed him the fabric. Look at his brand. Look at how he stares at the ridge like he's got somewhere to be. I think he was there, Tom. I think he knows what happened. Even if that's true, and it's a big if, how does that help you? You can't ask a horse to draw a map. No, but I can follow him. Let him lead me. Tom stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street. That ridge is dangerous country, Elias. Steep canyons, loose rock, rattlesnakes thick as grass in summer. And even if you find something, what then? That gold belongs to the army. There'd be a reward, sure, but you'd have to prove your claim, go through military bureaucracy. That takes time you don't have. I know. And Marcus Bray has been asking more questions about your ranch, about your finances. He's circling like a vulture. I know that too. Tom turned back to face him. Then why risk it? Why not just sell the horse like Bray offered and save yourself the trouble? Because that horse trusts me now, and because if there's even a chance I can find that wagon, can give those soldiers' families closure about what happened, that's worth something. Maybe worth more than my ranch. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. You always did have more honor than sense. All right, if you're going into that ridge, you take supplies, rope, water, provisions for 3 days minimum. And you tell me exactly when you're going so I know when to send a search party if you don't come back. Fair enough. And Elias, be careful. That ridge has taken men before. Don't let it take you too. Whisper rode back to his ranch as the afternoon sun painted long shadows across the valley. Midnight was standing at the fence when he arrived, and the horse's ears pricked forward with what looked almost like eagerness, like he knew something had changed, like he could sense that Whisper was finally understanding. "Is that it?" Whisper asked, approaching the corral. "You've been trying to tell me all along, trying to show me where you came from." Midnight tossed his head and pawed the ground. Then he turned and walked to the gate that led out toward the open land, toward the ridge in the distance. Danny emerged from the barn. "He's been doing that all afternoon, pacing, looking at the ridge, coming back to the gate. It's like he's getting impatient. He knows I figured it out." Whisper opened the gate. "Or he knows I'm finally ready to listen." Midnight walked through the gate immediately, then stopped and looked back, waiting. "Not today." "Boy," Whisper said, "we need to prepare first, need to do this right, but soon, I promise you soon." The horse stood there for another minute, then returned to the corral when Whisper offered hay, but his gaze kept drifting back to the ridge, and Whisper knew they were running out of time. Not just his time before foreclosure, but Midnight's time before whatever drove him toward that ridge became too urgent to ignore. That night, lying in bed, Whisper thought about 6 soldiers who never came home. Thought about families who never learned what happened to their sons and brothers and husbands. Thought about $50,000 in gold sitting somewhere in the wilderness, waiting for 5 years to be discovered. And he thought about a horse that had survived whatever happened, had carried that knowledge locked in his animal mind, had waited for someone trustworthy enough to follow him back to the place where everything changed. Tomorrow, he'd start preparing for the journey. He'd gather supplies, study maps, make arrangements for the ranch in his absence. And then he'd do something that probably qualified as crazy, even by his standards. He'd trust a wild stallion to lead him into some of the most dangerous territory in Montana, chasing a mystery that might be nothing more than his own desperate hope given shape. But sometimes, he thought as sleep finally claimed him, faith required a willingness to look foolish, and he'd rather look foolish following his principles than look wise compromising them. Preparation took 3 days, and every hour felt like borrowed time. Whisper worked with methodical care, checking and double-checking his supplies, rope 200 feet of good hemp, canteens 3, all full, dried beef, hardtack, beans, a bedroll, matches in a waterproof tin, his rifle and ammunition, though he hoped not to need them, a compass, though he suspected Midnight would be his real guide, first aid supplies, bandages, carbolic acid, needle and thread. Danny helped, his young hands quick and efficient. The boy had taken to sleeping in the barn most nights now, too excited about the upcoming journey to stay home. His father had given grudging permission, more because he was tired of arguing than because he approved. "You really think that horse knows where the wagon is?" Danny asked as they packed saddlebags. "I think he remembers something. Whether he can lead me to it, that's the gamble." "And if you find it, the gold?" Whisper paused in his work. "If we find it, it goes back to the army. There might be a reward, might not. Either way, those soldiers' families deserve to know what happened. Even if it means you still lose the ranch?" "Even then." Danny shook his head in wonder. "Most folks would keep the gold, claim they found it fair and square. Most folks didn't give their word to a horse that they'd do right by him." Whisper tied off a saddlebag. "Besides, I've lived long enough to know that money gotten dishonest has a way of costing more than it's worth." On the second day of preparation, Sadie visited. She brought more food, enough for the journey, and then some, and worry lined her face. They sat on the porch together, watching the sun track across the sky. "Tom told me what you're planning," she said quietly. "Figured he would. It's dangerous, Elias. That ridge, people have died out there. Good people with more experience than you." "I know." "Then why?" She turned to face him. "Why risk your life for a maybe?" He took his time answering, wanting to get it right. "You remember when Robert died? How you told me the hardest part wasn't the grief, but the not knowing if he suffered? If he had any last thoughts for you? Her eyes glistened. I remember. Those soldiers' families they've lived with, not knowing for 5 years. If I can give them answers, give them closure that's worth the risk. And if there's gold, if there's a reward that saves my ranch, well, that's just Providence smiling on doing the right thing. Sadie reached over and took his hand. You're a better man than this world deserves, Elias Vance. No, I'm just a man trying to keep promises, even the ones I made to a horse. She leaned against his shoulder, and they sat like that for a while, not speaking, just being present together. When she finally stood to leave, she kissed his cheek, a brief, warm touch that sent unexpected heat through his chest. Come back safe, she said, because I've got plans for you, and they don't include attending your funeral. After she left, Whisper touched his cheek where her lips had been and allowed himself a small smile. Life was strange. You could go years feeling alone, and then suddenly realize you weren't, that somewhere along the way, companionship had crept in quiet as morning fog. The third day brought an unwelcome visitor. Marcus Bray arrived in his buggy, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 men rode with him, hard-faced types, with guns on their hips and the look of men accustomed to violence. They stayed mounted while Bray climbed down. Heard you're planning an expedition, Bray said, walking to where Whisper stood by the corral. Into the ridge. Word travels fast. It does when I pay for it to. Bray smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I also heard an interesting theory about what you might be looking for out there. A certain lost army payroll, perhaps. Whisper kept his expression neutral. Don't know what you mean. Don't play stupid, Vance. That horse was part of the wagon team. You figured it out, and now you think he can lead you to the gold. Bray stepped closer. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take me with you. We'll find the gold together, split it 50-50. You get enough to pay off your debts, I get enough to make it worth my time. And if I refuse, then I'll have my friends here make sure you don't leave. I'll take the horse myself, follow him to the gold, and when the bank auctions your ranch next month, I'll buy it for nothing. Bray's smile widened. Your choice, but one way or another, I'm getting what I want. Whisper felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept it controlled. The gold belongs to the army. It's not mine to split with you or anyone else. The army wrote it off years ago. Finders keepers. That's not how it works. That's exactly how it works in the real world, Vance. The world where idealism gets you killed and practical men get rich. Bray gestured to his hired guns. Partners. Or do we do this the hard way? Before Whisper could answer, a voice called from the barn. Might want to reconsider that threat, Mr. Bray. Danny emerged carrying Whisper's rifle, held casual but ready. Behind him, from around the side of the house, came Sheriff Tom. On his horse, the lawman's hand rested on his own pistol. Afternoon, Marcus, Tom said mildly. These 2 friends of yours have warrants out of Helena, cattle rustling and assault. I'm going to need them to unbuckle their gun belts real slow and step down from those horses. Bray's face flushed red. You can't. I can, and I am. Boys, do as I said. The 2 hired guns looked at Bray, then at Tom's steady gaze and Danny's rifle, and made the smart choice. They dismounted and removed their weapons. Tom collected the guns and gestured toward town. Start walking. Station's 3 miles that way. You'll be comfortable in the cells until the marshal arrives from Helena. He looked at Bray. As for you, Marcus, I'd suggest you leave Mr. Vance alone. Any more threats, any more hired muscle, and I'll find reasons to make your life very difficult. Bray's jaw worked, fury plain on his face, but he was smart enough to know when he'd lost. This isn't over, Vance. Yes, Whisper said quietly. It is. Whatever happens with that ridge, whatever I find or don't find, you'll have no part in it. After Bray left driving his buggy, while his former hired guns walked ahead of Tom's horse, Danny lowered the rifle, his hands shaking slightly. That was terrifying. You did good, son. Whisper took the rifle and checked the safety. Where'd you learn to handle a gun like you meant business? Didn't. I was scared, senseless, but I figured looking confident was better than looking scared. Whisper laughed, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't managed in weeks. That's the secret to most of life, Danny. Acting like you know what you're doing until you figure it out for real. Tom rode back an hour later, having deposited the 2 men in his jail. Bray's going to be a problem, Elias. He knows about the gold now. He'll find a way to cause trouble. Can't worry about that. I've got enough to think about. When do you leave? Dawn tomorrow. Midnight's ready. I'm as prepared as I'll ever be. Time to see if my faith in that horse is justified. Tom dismounted and extended his hand. Whisper shook it, feeling the strength and sincerity in the grip. Good luck, friend. And if you don't come back in 4 days, I'm coming after you. Fair enough. That night, Whisper walked to the corral one last time. Midnight stood at the fence, silhouetted against the stars, looking toward the ridge. The horse's ears swiveled as Whisper approached, but his gaze stayed fixed on that distant darkness. Tomorrow, Whisper said softly. Tomorrow we go. You lead, and I'll follow. Just try not to get us both killed, all right? Midnight turned his head then, and in the starlight, his eyes gleamed. There was intelligence there, purpose, and something that might have been relief, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for someone to finally understand. Whisper went to bed early but slept poorly. His dreams were full of canyons and gold and horses running through darkness. When he woke before dawn, his heart was pounding and his mouth was dry with apprehension. Today was the day. Today he'd trust his life to a once wild stallion and ride into territory that had swallowed men before. Today he'd gamble everything on faith and a fragment of flag and the look in a horse's eyes. He dressed, made coffee, and ate a breakfast he barely tasted. Then he saddled Sage, loaded the pack horse Danny had borrowed from his father, and walked to Midnight's corral. The stallion was waiting at the gate, already alert, already ready. All right, boy, Whisper said, opening the gate. Show me what you've been trying to tell me all along. Midnight walked out, turned toward the ridge, and started moving with the purposeful stride of an animal who knew exactly where he was going. Whisper mounted Sage, took the pack horse's lead, and followed. Behind him, Danny and Sadie stood together on the porch, watching. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said. Now it was just a matter of faith and fate and whatever waited in the wild lands beyond Razorback Ridge. The journey to Razorback Ridge took most of the morning. Midnight moved with certainty, never hesitating at crossroads or seeming uncertain about direction. He led them northeast, away from the established trails, through territory that grew progressively wilder. Sage followed with the steady temperament of a mare who'd seen enough of life not to be rattled by rough country, and the pack horse trailed behind, occasionally snorting its displeasure at the terrain. By noon, they'd reached the base of the ridge itself, a massive geological formation that rose like a spine from the earth, all grey rock and scrub pine and hidden dangers. Whisper paused to let the horses drink from a creek that tumbled down from the heights, and he studied the landscape with growing unease. The ridge was bigger than he'd imagined, 30 miles long, someone had said, but seeing it in person made that number feel inadequate. There were 1,000 places a wagon could have disappeared, ravines, caves, canyons carved by ancient water. Finding anything in this wilderness seemed impossible. But Midnight didn't share his doubt. The stallion drank briefly, then continued up a narrow game trail that wound between boulders and stunted trees. The path was barely wide enough for a horse, let alone a wagon, but Whisper trusted the animal's instincts. They climbed for 2 hours, the air growing thinner and cooler, the sun beating down on rock that radiated stored heat. They crested a false summit and found themselves looking at a maze of canyons cutting through the ridge. Midnight paused here, his head swinging left and right, nostrils working. For the first time since they'd started, he seemed uncertain. "Take your time," Whisper said quietly. "We're not in a hurry." The stallion moved forward slowly now, testing directions, doubling back, trying again. It was like watching someone search through memories that had grown hazy with time. Finally, Midnight's ears pricked forward, and he turned sharply right, entering a narrow canyon whose walls rose high enough to block the sun. The temperature dropped immediately. Water dripped from somewhere overhead, echoing in the enclosed space. Sage didn't like it. Her ears kept swiveling nervously, but she trusted Whisper enough to keep following. The canyon twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing to the point where Whisper had to dismount and lead the horses sideways through gaps in the rock. "If this is the route that wagon took," Whisper muttered, "no wonder nobody found them. You'd have to know exactly where you were going." They emerged from the canyon into a wider ravine, and here Midnight's pace quickened. He moved faster, more urgently, and Whisper had to push Sage to keep up. The ravine angled upward, climbing the ridge's eastern face, and the footing became treacherous loose scree that shifted under the horses' hooves. Then Midnight stopped. They'd reached what looked like a dead end, a sheer rock wall rising 200 feet, unclimbable. Whisper's heart sank. Had they come all this way for nothing? Had the horses' memories been wrong? But Midnight didn't turn back. Instead, he moved along the base of the cliff, working his way north until he reached a section where a massive rock slide had created a jumble of boulders. The stallion picked his way through the boulders with careful steps, and Whisper saw it a gap, a fissure in the rock face, maybe 4 feet wide, almost completely hidden by the fallen stone around it. "Well, I'll be damned," Whisper breathed. He dismounted and approached the fissure on foot, leading Sage. The opening was narrow but passable for a horse or a man. Beyond it, darkness stretched into the mountain. Midnight entered without hesitation, and Whisper struck a match to see what lay ahead. The fissure was actually a natural tunnel, carved through the rock by ancient water or geological forces. The ceiling was low enough that Whisper had to duck in places, but wide enough for the horses to move single file. The walls were smooth, worn by time, and they gleamed wet in the matchlight. They moved through the tunnel for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes. Then, ahead, Whisper saw light. Natural light, green-tinged and warm. The tunnel was opening into something. They emerged into a hidden valley that stole Whisper's breath. The valley was, perhaps, a mile across, completely enclosed by the towering walls of the ridge. A stream ran through its center, fed by springs somewhere in the rock. Grass grew thick and green, impossible grass, given the drought that had turned the rest of Montana brown. Trees dotted the landscape, cottonwoods and willows clustered near the water. Birds sang in the branches. The air was cooler here, moistened by the stream, and it smelled of growing things. It was a paradise cut off from the dying world outside, a place where water and life had persisted, while everything beyond these walls withered. But Whisper barely registered the beauty. His attention was fixed on what stood in the center of the valley, near the stream. A wagon, old, weather-beaten, its canvas cover long since rotted away. The wooden wheels had partly sunk into the soft ground, and the whole structure leaned to one side. Around it, barely visible in the tall grass, were darker shapes. Bones, Whisper realized with a cold feeling in his gut. Human bones and horse bones, scattered by time and scavengers, but still marking where they'd fallen. Midnight walked toward the wagon with slow, almost reverent steps. When he reached it, he stopped and lowered his head. The pose was unmistakable grief, or as close to it as a horse could express. Whisper approached on foot, his heart pounding. This was it, the lost payroll wagon. 5 years lost, hidden in a valley that shouldn't exist, guarded by walls that had kept searchers out and kept this secret in. The wagon bed still held its cargo, heavy wooden boxes bound with iron straps. Whisper counted 6 of them. With trembling hands, he used his knife to pry open the nearest box. Gold bars gleamed in the afternoon sun, stamped with U.S. Army marks. Each bar probably weighed 20 pounds. He did quick calculations. If all 6 boxes were full, this was easily $50,000 or more. But the gold wasn't what held his attention for long. Scattered around the wagon were personal effects, tin cups, a Bible with water-damaged pages, a photograph of a woman and child in a leather frame. And near the wagon's front, arranged with obvious care, were 6 flat rocks standing upright in the earth, grave markers. Someone had buried the soldiers, someone had taken the time to lay them to rest with dignity. Whisper looked at Midnight, understanding flooding through him. You did this. You buried them, or you tried to, as much as a horse could. Midnight's ears swiveled toward his voice, and the stallion's eyes held that same deep intelligence Whisper had seen from the beginning. The picture came together in his mind. The wagon had been traveling through the ravine, maybe taking a shortcut, maybe lost, maybe fleeing something. They'd found the tunnel entrance, passed through, emerged in this valley, and then what? An accident? Disease? The stream water was clean, the valley safe. But something had killed those men. He examined the site more carefully and found the answer carved into a tree near the wagon. The 14th of April, 1873. Ambush in the ravine. Johnson shot dead. Rest of us wounded. Made it here, but infection setting in. God have mercy. Ambush. They'd been attacked, had fled here to hide and recover, but infection had taken them one by one. The horses had either died or run off, all except Midnight, who'd stayed, who'd remained with his team even after they were gone, who'd survived on the valley's grass and water, trapped by walls he couldn't climb, and a tunnel he wouldn't leave because it meant abandoning the men he'd served. How long had he stayed? Months? Years? Until finally starvation or loneliness had driven him back through the tunnel, back into the world, where he'd been caught and sold and brutalized by men who saw him as a beast to be broken. And all that time, he'd carried the knowledge of this place, this secret, this fortune in gold, and the graves of 6 soldiers who died doing their duty. Whisper knelt beside the stone markers, his throat tight. "I'll tell their families," he said quietly, "that you fought and fled and died trying to survive. That's honor enough for any man." He stood and looked at the gold again. $50,000. More than enough to save his ranch 100 times over, more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. And by law, by the murky law of salvage and discovery, may be his to claim. But he knew what he had to do. The same thing those soldiers would have done. The right thing. He would report this to the army, would lead them here, would make sure the gold went where it was supposed to go, and the soldiers' remains went home to their families. There might be a reward, might not. But either way, he'd be able to sleep at night, knowing he'd honored the trust Midnight had placed in him. The stallion had led him here not to make him rich, but to bring justice to the men who'd served with him, to give them the burial they deserved and the recognition they'd earned. That was worth more than gold. It had to be. Whisper walked back to Midnight and stroked the horse's neck. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for trusting me with this, for believing I'd do right by them." Midnight leaned into his touch, and for the first time since Whisper had bought him, the horse made a sound, a low, rumbling nicker that spoke of relief and release. His mission, 5 years in the making, was finally complete. They'd camp here tonight, Whisper decided. Document everything. In the morning they'd return to Copper Springs, and he'd report to Sheriff Tom. From there, things would unfold however they were meant to. But standing in that hidden valley, with the late afternoon sun painting everything golden, Whisper felt something he hadn't felt in months. He felt peace, not certainty about his future, not confidence that everything would work out. Just peace that he'd made the right choice and followed the right path. Sometimes that was all a man could ask for. Sometimes it was everything. Whisper spent that evening documenting everything. He sketched a map of the route they'd taken, marked the tunnel entrance, drew the valley's layout. He examined each grave marker, copying down what little information the weathered carvings still held. He photographed the scene with the small camera he'd brought, a luxury expense from 2 years ago that now proved its worth. He carefully opened each box to verify the gold, counted the bars, and recorded the army stamps and serial numbers. The soldiers' personal effects he gathered carefully, treating them with the reverence they deserved. 6 men, young by the look of the bones and the dates carved on the tree. The photograph showed a man of perhaps 25, with a wife and infant child. Johnson, the one mentioned as being shot dead in the ambush. His family had never known what became of him. Now, finally, they would. Midnight grazed peacefully nearby, and Whisper noticed something he'd missed before. The horses' scars, the ones he'd carried since the auction, they told a story now that Whisper could read. The marks from chains and harsh treatment, yes, but also older scars. A bullet graze along his shoulder, cuts from thorns or rocks during a desperate flight. This horse had lived through violence and survival and loyalty, and somehow maintained the capacity for trust. "You're something special," Whisper said to him. "I hope you know that." As darkness fell, he built a small fire near the wagon and made camp. The valley took on a different character at night, peaceful but also slightly eerie, knowing that 6 men had died here. He could hear the stream's constant murmur, the rustle of leaves, night birds calling. It was beautiful and melancholy all at once. He slept fitfully, his mind already racing ahead to what would come next. Sheriff Tom would have to be informed immediately. Then the Army likely officers from Fort Benton would need to visit the site, verify the claim, to arrange for the remains to be transported home. The gold would be secured, inventoried, returned to wherever it belonged. There would be paperwork, questions, probably an investigation into how he'd found what trained search parties had missed. And through it all, the mortgage clock would keep ticking. 27 days left now. He'd be away from the ranch at least 4 or 5 more days, just dealing with authorities and leading them back here. That left 3 weeks to somehow earn or borrow $200. Even with the best will in the world, even with the Army's gratitude, bureaucracy moved slow and money moved slower. He might lose the ranch anyway, might do all of this, honor all his promises, and still end up homeless. But he'd do it anyway, because some things mattered more than property. Dawn came cold and clear. Whisper broke camp methodically, packing away his notes and sketches, ensuring he'd left the site as undisturbed as possible. Before leaving, he stood before the 6 stone markers one final time. "I'll be back," he promised the dead, "with people who'll take you home proper. Rest easy until then." The journey back through the tunnel felt different somehow. Easier, maybe, now that he knew what lay on both sides. Midnight led the way again, moving with less urgency now that his burden had been shared. When they emerged into the ravine, the morning sun hit Whisper's face with welcome warmth. They made good time descending the ridge, and by early afternoon had reached the creek where they'd stopped the day before. Whisper let the horses drink and refilled his canteens. The pack horse had held up well, and Sage seemed actually energized rather than tired. Even Midnight showed no signs of fatigue. "Just another few hours," Whisper told them, "then you all get proper rest and feed." They were following a game trail along the creek's edge when Midnight suddenly stopped, his head coming up sharply, his ears pinned back, and his nostrils flared. Whisper felt immediate alarm. The horse had shown him nothing but calm confidence all trip, so this reaction meant something was wrong. Then he heard it. Voices. Multiple men, somewhere ahead where the trail met the main road. Whisper dismounted quietly and moved forward on foot, staying low. Through the brush, he could see 4 men with horses. 3 he didn't recognize, rough-looking types with guns and hard faces. The 4th he knew immediately, Marcus Bray. His heart sank. Of course, Bray had guessed where he was going and what he might find, and now he'd set up an ambush, waiting for Whisper's return. Whisper backed away carefully, returning to where Midnight and the other horses waited. His mind raced through options. He could try to go around, but this trail was the only safe route through this part of the ridge. Any other path would add a full day to his journey and take him through terrain that was too dangerous for the horses. He could wait them out. But how long would Bray stay? And what happened to the ranch while Whisper sat here hiding? Or he could confront them. 4 armed men against one aging horse trainer with a rifle he'd rather not use. He checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded. Then he remounted Sage and took a deep breath. Sometimes the only way through fear was straight ahead. "Stay close," he said to Midnight, "and if shooting starts, you run. You understand? You've done your part. No need for you to die for human foolishness." Midnight snorted but stayed beside Sage as they moved forward. Bray saw them first. He stepped into the trail, blocking the way, his hired guns arrayed behind him. All 4 men were armed, though their weapons were holstered. Not ready for violence yet, but prepared for it. "Well, well," Bray called out. "You look like a man who found something interesting. Move aside, Marcus. I've got business in town." "I'm sure you do. Business involving a certain army payroll, I'd wager." Bray smiled his cold smile. "Did you find it?" "Course you did. I can see it in your face." "Where is it?" "That's between me and the authorities." "See, that's where you're wrong." Bray's expression hardened. "You're going to take us to that gold right now. We'll retrieve it, split it, and then you can tell whatever story you want to the sheriff. By then, the gold will be long gone, and there'll be no proof it ever existed. I have documentation, photographs, maps, which you'll hand over, along with that horse." Bray gestured to Midnight. "That animal's worth money too, now that he's tamed. I'll take him as well." Whisper felt cold anger settling in his gut. "You're not taking anything, Marcus. Not the gold, not the horse, not my documentation. Now move, or I'll ride through you." One of the hired guns laughed. "You and what army, old man?" "Just me." Whisper raised his rifle, cocked but not yet aimed. "But I'm the one who grew up hunting these ridges. I'm the one who knows every ravine and box canyon within 10 miles. And I'm the one who has absolutely nothing left to lose. So ask yourself, is Marcus Bray paying you enough to die for his greed?" The hired guns shifted uncomfortably. Bray's face flushed red. "You're bluffing," Bray said. "You're a horse trainer, not a killer." "You're right. I'm not a killer, but I'm also not going to let you steal from dead soldiers and their families. So yes, Marcus, I will shoot. Maybe I'll miss. Maybe you'll get me first. But someone's definitely dying today if you don't move." For a long moment, nobody breathed. The creek burbled over rocks. A crow called somewhere overhead. 4 men with guns faced 1 man with determination, and the math wasn't as simple as numbers suggested. Finally, one of the hired guns spoke up. "I didn't sign on for murder. He's right, you ain't paying enough for that." The man turned his horse and rode away. A second man followed. "Yeah, I'm out too." That left Bray and 1 remaining tough, a scarred man who looked mean enough to enjoy violence, but even he was reconsidering now that the odds had shifted. "This isn't over, Vance," Bray spat. "I know where you're going, I know what you found, and I have friends, real friends, not cowards like these 2. You report that gold, and I'll make sure you never see a penny of reward. I'll tie you up in legal claims and disputes for years. You'll die poor and homeless, while lawyers get fat arguing over who has rights to what." "Maybe so," Whisper said quietly, "but I'll die knowing I did right by those soldiers and that horse. That's worth more than all your gold and property combined." He nudged Sage forward. For a moment, it looked like Bray's remaining hired gun might draw. His hand moved toward his pistol. But Midnight, massive, powerful Midnight, stepped forward and bared his teeth, and the man's nerve broke. He backed his horse away. Bray had to step aside or be ridden over. He chose to step aside, but his eyes promised retribution. Whisper rode past without looking back, though every muscle in his back tensed, expecting a bullet. It didn't come. When they'd gone 100 yards, he finally let out the breath he'd been holding. "That was either very brave or very stupid," he muttered to himself. Midnight tossed his head as if to say it had been necessary, and maybe it had been. Sometimes a man had to stand up for what was right, even when the odds were terrible and the outcome uncertain. They reached Copper Springs as the sun was setting. Whisper rode straight to the sheriff's office, where Tom was locking up for the night. "Elias," Tom's eyes widened. "You're back. Did you—" "I found it, Tom. The wagon, the gold, the soldiers, all of it." Whisper dismounted stiffly. "And we need to move fast. Marcus Bray knows, and he's going to try to cause trouble. Tell me everything." As Whisper recounted the journey, the tunnel, the hidden valley, the graves, the gold, and finally the confrontation with Bray, Tom's expression shifted from surprise to concern to determination. "All right," Tom said when Whisper finished. "First thing in the morning, I send a telegram to Fort Benton. Military authority trumps any civil claims Bray might try to make. Second, I'm deputizing Danny and 3 other reliable men to guard your ranch and that horse. Bray makes a move against either one, he's going to jail. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get complicated before it gets simple." Tom paused. "But you did good, Elias. Real good. Those families deserve to know, and you gave them that." Whisper nodded, suddenly exhausted. "I need to get these horses settled. Then I need about 12 hours of sleep. Take your time. Tomorrow, the real work begins." Whisper led Midnight and the other horses to his ranch, where Danny was waiting anxiously. The boy had kept the place running, had maintained the routine, and nearly cried with relief when he saw them return safely. That night, after the horses were fed and watered, after Danny had been filled in on everything, after Sadie had arrived with food and tears and an embrace that lasted longer than propriety suggested, Whisper finally lay down in his own bed. He'd found the lost payroll, he'd honored the dead soldiers, he'd kept faith with Midnight. But tomorrow would bring new challenges, bureaucrats and questions, and Marcus Bray's promised interference. And through it all, the mortgage clock kept ticking. 26 days now, 26 days to turn moral victory into practical survival. But tonight, he'd done right, and that had to be enough. The army arrived 4 days later, a full cavalry detail led by Captain Richard Morrison, grandson of the very officer who'd given Whisper's father the pocket watch decades ago. The connection felt like providence, like the universe closing circles that had been left open too long. Morrison was a professional soldier in his 40s, with grey threading through his dark hair and the bearing of a man who took duty seriously. He listened to Whisper's account with careful attention, examined the documentation, studied the photographs, and asked precise questions about the valley's location and condition. "You understand? This is an extraordinary claim," Morrison said, sitting across from Whisper in Tom's office. 5 years, multiple search parties, and suddenly a civilian horse trainer finds what we couldn't? "I understand how it sounds, Captain, but I can lead you there. You can verify everything yourself. The horse this Midnight, you're certain he was part of the original wagon team? The brand matches Army specifications from that period. The flag fragment was tangled in his mane. And the way he went straight to that valley, he knew exactly where he was going. He'd been there before." Morrison nodded slowly. "Draft horses were part of the team. Records show 8 horses pulling the wagon. If one survived and was later caught wild, yes, it's possible." He stood and walked to the window. "Mr. Vance, if this is real, if those men are truly there, you've done a great service to 6 families who've been living with uncertainty for half a decade. They'll finally have closure. The Army owes you a debt. I just want to see those soldiers buried proper and their families told the truth, the gold that's yours to deal with. There is typically a finder's fee for recovered military property. 10% of the value is standard. For $50,000 in gold, that would be $5,000. Whisper's heart skipped. $5,000. Enough to pay the mortgage 20 times over, enough to secure the ranch for years. But bureaucracy was slow, and, as if reading his thoughts, Morrison continued, "Of course, such payment requires verification, official reports, the approval from command. The process typically takes 3 to 6 months. I understand. How much time do you have?" The directness of the question surprised Whisper. He glanced at Tom, who nodded encouragingly. 22 days. Then the bank forecloses. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out a leather folder from his satchel and wrote something on official letterhead. This is a promissory letter, signed by me as commanding officer and witnessed by Sheriff Bodie. It states that pending verification of your claim, the Army intends to pay you a finder's fee of $5,000. It's not cash, but it might be enough to convince your bank to grant an extension. Captain, my grandfather spoke of your father often, called him the finest scout he ever worked with, said Samuel Vance was a man of unquestionable honor. Morrison handed over the letter. Seems that honor runs in the family. The Army takes care of those who serve it, and those who serve its fallen. This is the least I can do. They left the next morning, Whisper, Captain Morrison, 10 cavalry soldiers, and a wagon for transporting the remains. Danny stayed behind to watch the ranch, armed with Tom's extra rifle and the promise of backup if Bray caused trouble. The journey to the valley took longer with the full detail, but Morrison's men were experienced in rough terrain. When they finally emerged from the tunnel into the hidden valley, several of the soldiers gasped. Even Morrison, trained to maintain composure, looked shaken by the beauty of the place and the tragedy it contained. The verification process was thorough and respectful. Morrison examined every grave marker, photographed the wagon from multiple angles, inventoried the gold bar by bar, and treated the personal effects with reverence. When they found the carved message on the tree, the final testimony of dying men, several soldiers removed their hats. Ambushed, wounded, fled here to recover, Morrison read aloud. Never made it home. These men died doing their duty, and they deserve to be remembered as heroes, not deserters. He turned to Whisper, Thank you for finding them. Thank you for caring enough to look. The remains were carefully gathered and placed in coffins the soldiers had brought. Each man was identified as much as possible through personal effects and position. The gold was loaded into the Army wagon, inventoried with Whisper's documentation serving as the primary record. As they prepared to leave, Morrison walked to where Midnight stood, grazing near the stream. The horse raised his head, watching the officer approach. You served well, Morrison said softly, reaching out to touch the stallion's neck. You stayed loyal when you could have fled. You kept your team's secret until you found someone worthy of it. The Army thanks you, soldier. Midnight leaned into the touch, and something in his eyes looked peaceful, released. His long duty was finally, truly over. They sealed the tunnel entrance with markers and warnings, ensuring no one would accidentally stumble into the valley and disturb what should remain a memorial. Then they began the journey back to civilization, carrying lost soldiers home at last. They arrived back in Copper Springs to find the town in an uproar. Marcus Bray had not been idle during Whisper's absence. He'd filed legal claims with the territorial court, arguing that any treasure found on public land belonged to whoever claimed it first, not to some aging horse trainer with a convenient story. He'd spread rumors that Whisper had invented the whole thing or was hiding gold he'd found elsewhere. He'd even attempted to buy Whisper's mortgage debt from the bank directly. He's been like a hornet in a jar, Tom told Whisper as they stood outside the sheriff's office, stirring up trouble every way he can. Got half the town thinking you're trying to pull some kind of swindle. Captain Morrison overheard this, and his expression hardened. Mr. Bray is interfering with military recovery operations. That's a federal offense. He's also trespassing, Tom added. Caught him trying to sneak onto Vance's property last night. Danny fired a warning shot that sent him running. Then let's settle this properly, Morrison said. Where can I find Mr. Bray? They found him at the saloon, holding court with several townspeople who'd been swayed by his version of events. Bray's expression shifted from confident to wary when Morrison walked in, still in full uniform, followed by 4 armed soldiers. Marcus Bray? Morrison's voice carried military authority that silenced the room immediately. Captain, Bray stood, trying to maintain his composure. If this is about the gold, I've filed proper legal claims. Your claims are void. The gold belonged to the United States Army. It has been recovered and is now in military custody. The soldiers' remains have been retrieved and will be returned to their families. Mr. Vance has been officially recognized as the finder and will receive appropriate compensation. You can't just, I can, and I have. Furthermore, you've been interfering with a federal recovery operation and spreading false information about a matter of military jurisdiction. You're fortunate I don't have you arrested. Any further interference, any attempts to claim what isn't yours, and I'll personally ensure you face federal charges. Am I clear? Bray's face had gone red, then pale. Perfectly clear, Captain. Good. Now, I believe you also attempted to purchase Mr. Vance's mortgage debt with the intention of forcing foreclosure. The bank has informed me they declined your offer. Consider any future such attempts to be harassment, which Sheriff Bodie will handle accordingly. After Morrison left taking his soldiers and his absolute authority with him, the saloon remained silent. Then Sadie, standing behind the bar, spoke up loud enough for everyone to hear. Marcus Bray's been trying to steal this town piece by piece for 2 years, buying up properties cheap, forcing good people out. Well, I, for one, am glad someone finally stood up to him. She looked around the room. Elias Vance did something brave and honorable. He could have kept that gold, could have gotten rich. Instead, he did right by dead soldiers and their families. That's the kind of man we should be supporting, not tearing down. One by one, townspeople nodded. The mood shifted. Bray found himself suddenly isolated, his influence crumbling. He left the saloon without another word, and Whisper suspected they wouldn't see much of him in Copper Springs anymore. Men like Bray thrived where they were feared or respected. Where they were neither, they tended to move on to easier prey. The next day, Whisper took Morrison's promissory letter to the bank. The manager, a fastidious man named Horace Pendleton, read it carefully, adjusted his spectacles, and read it again. This is quite extraordinary, Mr. Vance. Will it be enough for an extension? Pendleton considered. The Army's word is good, very good, but $5,000, even promised, doesn't help your immediate situation. You still owe $217 in, he checked his ledger, 16 days. Whisper's heart sank. He'd hoped somehow this would be enough. Then Pendleton smiled, a rare expression on his usually stern face. However, I've just received several deposits to your account. It seems various townspeople have been quietly contributing funds. $1 here, $5 there. Sadie Crane contributed $50 just this morning. Even young Danny Reeves brought in his entire savings, $12. What? The town is rallying behind you, Mr. Vance. In total, these contributions amount to $143. Combined with the $47 you have remaining, that brings you to $190. You're only $27 short. I can't accept charity. It's not charity when people invest in someone they believe in. Pendleton pulled out a form. I'm also authorized to offer you a 30-day extension at reduced interest, given the circumstances and the Army's promissory letter. That gives you time for the Army payment to process, at which point you'll be able to settle all debts and have significant funds remaining. Whisper sat down heavily, overwhelmed. Why would you do that? Because Captain Morrison personally vouched for you. Because this town needs men of integrity more than it needs punctual mortgage payments. And because, Pendleton's expression softened further, my own son was one of those soldiers, Private James Pendleton. Now, thanks to you, I'll finally be able to bring him home and give him a proper burial. The banker's voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Whisper understood. This wasn't about money or policy. This was about a father who'd lived 5 years, not knowing what happened to his boy. I'm sorry for your loss, Whisper said quietly. He died honorably. The message they left, they all did. I know, and I'll be forever grateful you gave me that knowledge. Pendleton extended his hand. Thank you, Mr. Vance, for everything. They shook hands, and Whisper walked out of the bank, a free man, not wealthy yet, but secure. The ranch was safe. The soldiers were going home. Justice had been served. And it had all started with a choice to spend his last dollars on a horse everyone else had given up on. 3 months later, autumn had come to Montana Territory with its usual dramatic flair. The aspens turned gold on the mountainsides, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. The drought had finally broken with September rains, and the valley around Copper Springs was slowly returning to green. Whisper stood at his corral fence, watching midnight graze in the afternoon sun. The stallion had filled out, his coat gleaming with health, his movements relaxed and confident. The scars were still there, they always would be, but they were just marks now, not wounds. The horse had healed, inside and out. The army's payment had arrived 6 weeks after their return from the valley. $5,000, exactly as promised. Whisper had paid off his mortgage in full, repaid every person who'd contributed to his rescue, and put the rest aside for the ranch's future. For the first time in years, he could breathe without the weight of debt pressing on his chest. But the money wasn't the real treasure. That had come in other forms. The 6 soldiers had been laid to rest in a ceremony at Fort Benton, attended by their families and honored with full military recognition. Whisper had been there, along with Danny and Sadie and Sheriff Tom. He'd met the families, had shaken their hands, had seen the gratitude and grief and relief in their eyes. Horace Pendleton had wept openly at his son's graveside, finally able to say goodbye properly. Captain Morrison had given a speech about duty and honor and the bond between soldiers and the animals who served alongside them. He'd singled out Midnight, standing calm and steady, with Whisper holding his lead as a symbol of loyalty that transcended species. The horse had been officially recognized in Army records as having served with distinction, his 5 years guarding his fallen team noted as an act of extraordinary devotion. The story had spread through the territory and beyond. Newspaper reporters had come calling, wanting to write about the horse trainer who'd trusted an animal's instincts and found a fortune in gold. Whisper had politely declined most interviews, letting Morrison handle the official accounts. Fame didn't interest him. He'd done what felt right, and that was reward enough. What did interest him was the life taking shape around him now. Danny had formally apprenticed himself to Whisper, moving into the ranch's small bunkhouse and dedicating himself to learning everything about horse training. The boy had a gift for it, patient hands, and an intuitive understanding of animal behavior. In another 5 years, Whisper thought, Danny would be ready to train on his own. Maybe they'd become partners. Maybe Danny would take over eventually. Either way, the knowledge wouldn't die with Whisper. It would continue. And Sadie had become something more than a friend. They'd courted properly over the summer, spending evenings on his porch or hers, talking about everything and nothing. She made him laugh in ways he'd forgotten he could. She challenged him when he got too stubborn. She fit into his life like she'd always been meant to be there. Last week, he'd asked her to marry him. She'd said yes before he'd even finished the question. The sound of a wagon approaching pulled him from his thoughts. Sadie drove up in her buggy, waving as she climbed down. She wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, and her smile lit up the late afternoon. "How's our famous horse?" she asked, walking to the fence. "Spoiled rotten. Danny gives him extra feed when he thinks I'm not looking. Good. He deserves to be spoiled after everything he's been through." She slipped her arm through Whisper's. "I came to tell you the arrangements are finalized. Small ceremony, just close friends and family. 3 weeks from Saturday. 3 weeks. Barely time to get nervous." "You're not getting nervous on me, Elias Vance." "No, ma'am. Just contemplating how a man my age got lucky enough to find a woman like you. Not luck, just good sense on both our parts." She leaned against his shoulder, comfortable and easy. "Have you decided what you're going to do with Midnight? Several people have asked about buying him. One rancher offered $1,000. He's not for sale. Not ever. That horse gave me everything. Faith, purpose, the means to save this place. I owe him a home for life, and that's what he's getting." "I knew you'd say that. It's one of the reasons I love you." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the horse graze. Midnight raised his head and looked at them, and Whisper could have sworn the stallion's expression held contentment. The wild rage was gone. The fear was gone. What remained was simply a good horse living a good life, which was all any creature really wanted. Danny emerged from the barn carrying grooming supplies. When he saw Sadie, he grinned and waved. "Miss Crane, you staying for supper?" "If Whisper's cooking, absolutely not. If I'm cooking, then yes." "Hey now," Whisper protested with mock offense. "My beans are perfectly edible." "Edible and enjoyable are two different things, dear." Danny laughed and went to work on Sage in the adjacent corral. The sound of his cheerful whistling drifted across the ranch. A gentle breeze moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called. This, Whisper thought, was what happiness looked like. Not wealth or fame or adventure, just a good piece of land, honest work, people you cared about, and animals that trusted you. Just the knowledge that you'd done right when you could have done wrong, and that the consequences of that choice rippled outward in ways both seen and unseen. Midnight walked to the fence and nuzzled Whisper's hand, a gesture of affection the horse had learned to give freely now. Whisper stroked the velvet nose and felt the solid warmth of muscle and bone and beating heart. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything you taught me, for leading me exactly where I needed to go." The horse's ears swiveled forward, listening. Then Midnight turned and walked back to his grazing, peaceful and secure in a world that had finally learned to treat him with the gentleness he deserved. As the sun settled toward the western horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and gold, Whisper stood with Sadie's hand in his and watched his small corner of Montana territory glow with late-season light. The future stretched ahead, uncertain in its details, but solid in its foundation. He had work to do, a wedding to prepare for, a boy to train, and a horse to care for. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything that mattered. And when the last light faded and the stars began to emerge overhead, Whisper walked back to his house with his future wife beside him, grateful beyond measure for the day he'd chosen compassion over common sense and faith over fear. Sometimes the strongest bonds really weren't forged through force, but through trust in something everyone else had given up on. He'd learned that from a wild stallion, and he'd carry that lesson for whatever years remained to him, passing it on to anyone willing to listen. That was his legacy. Not gold, not fame, but wisdom earned through patience and proven through action. And there was no treasure in any hidden valley that could match the value of that.